The sound of rain against the window seemed to echo the thundering of Kyle Richardson's heart as he stood in the doorway of Tyler Robinson's apartment at midnight, water dripping from his dark hair onto the hardwood floor. His eyes, usually so confident and sure, held a vulnerability that Tyler had never seen before, and the words that tumbled from Kyle's lips cut through the silence like a confession whispered in the dark. "I know it's late, and I know this is crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about what you said earlier about not wanting to be alone tonight. And I realized that maybe I don't want to be alone either. Not anymore, not without you." Tyler's breath caught in his throat as he processed the weight of those words. The way Kyle's voice trembled slightly on the last syllable. The way his friend's hand shook as he reached out tentatively, as if asking permission to bridge the gap between them that had been growing wider and more charged with each passing day. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, as if the very atmosphere had shifted to accommodate this moment that Tyler had imagined countless times but never dared believe could actually happen. "Kyle," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm outside, and in that single word was contained months of suppressed longing, weeks of careful observation, days of wondering if the electricity he felt whenever their hands accidentally brushed was real or simply a product of his own desperate imagination. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, standing in a doorway at midnight with the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. We need to go back to where it all began, 3 months earlier, when Kyle Richardson first knocked on Tyler Robinson's door with a six-pack of beer and a smile that could have powered the entire city block. Tyler had been living alone in the small apartment for nearly a year, content with his routine of morning coffee, evening novels, and the occasional video call with his sister Sarah Martinez, who lived across the country and never failed to remind him that he needed to get out more, meet people, stop hiding behind his books and his carefully constructed walls. He had grown comfortable with solitude, or at least that's what he told himself during the long evenings when the silence felt more oppressive than peaceful. When he found himself staring at his phone, wondering if he should text someone, anyone, just to hear another human voice. The knock on his door that Thursday evening in September had been unexpected. And when Tyler opened it to find Kyle Richardson standing there with that easy grin and those impossibly green eyes, he felt something shift inside his chest. A recognition that he couldn't quite name, but that settled into his bones like coming home. "Hey, you must be Tyler," Kyle had said, extending his hand in a gesture that was both casual and somehow intimate, the way his fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary when Tyler shook it. "I just moved in down the hall, apartment 4B, and I thought I'd introduce myself to the neighbors. I brought beer as a peace offering in case my music gets too loud or I burn dinner and set off the smoke alarms." Tyler had invited him in almost without thinking, drawn by something indefinable in Kyle's presence. The way he seemed to fill the space not with his physical size but with an energy that made the apartment feel more alive than it had in months. They had talked until nearly 3 in the morning that first night about books and movies and travel, about Kyle's job as a graphic designer and Tyler's work as a freelance writer, about their shared love of old jazz records and their mutual inability to keep houseplants alive. "I have this theory," Kyle had said as they sat on Tyler's couch, their legs stretched out and nearly touching, the empty beer bottles scattered on the coffee table between them, "that people who kill plants aren't necessarily bad at taking care of things. They're just too focused on trying to control the outcome instead of letting things grow naturally." Tyler had laughed at that, a real laugh that surprised him with its genuineness, and Kyle had smiled in response, a smile that reached his eyes and made Tyler feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. There had been something in that moment, a charge in the air, that Tyler tried to dismiss as the product of too much alcohol and too little social interaction. But even as Kyle gathered his jacket and headed for the door, Tyler knew that something fundamental had shifted. Over the following weeks, Kyle had become a constant presence in Tyler's life, dropping by with takeout from the Thai place down the street, inviting himself over to watch movies on Tyler's ridiculously large television, showing up at Tyler's door with a bottle of wine and a story about his latest dating disaster that always seemed to end with him shaking his head and declaring that he was clearly doing something wrong, but couldn't figure out what. It's like I'm following a script, Kyle had said one evening in October as they sat in Tyler's kitchen, sharing a pizza and a bottle of red wine that had cost more than Tyler usually spent on groceries in a week. I meet someone, we go on a few dates, everything seems fine on paper, but then I just feel this overwhelming sense of emptiness, like I'm playing a character in someone else's life. Tyler had nodded sympathetically, even as his heart performed complicated acrobatics in his chest, because he understood that feeling all too well, had experienced it himself in every relationship he'd attempted over the past few years. That sense of going through the motions without ever feeling truly connected to another person. What he couldn't tell Kyle, what he barely admitted to himself, was that sitting here in his kitchen, sharing pizza and wine and conversation that flowed as easily as breathing, felt more real and more right than anything he'd experienced in years. Maybe you're just looking for the wrong things, Tyler had suggested carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral, even as his pulse quickened at the way Kyle was looking at him, head tilted slightly to one side, those green eyes studying Tyler's face as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. What do you mean? Kyle had asked, leaning forward slightly, and Tyler had felt the familiar flutter of panic mixed with hope that had become his constant companion whenever their conversations ventured into this territory. I mean, maybe the problem isn't that you're doing something wrong. Maybe it's that you're trying to force connections that aren't meant to happen instead of recognizing the ones that already exist. The words had hung between them like a confession, and Tyler had immediately regretted his boldness, certain that he'd revealed too much, crossed a line that would make Kyle uncomfortable and ruin the easy friendship that had become the brightest part of Tyler's days. But Kyle had simply nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, and reached across the table to briefly squeeze Tyler's hand. You always know exactly what to say, Kyle had murmured, and the warmth of his fingers against Tyler's skin had sent electricity shooting up Tyler's arm, a sensation so intense that he'd had to resist the urge to pull away, not because he didn't want the contact, but because he wanted it too much. That night, after Kyle had gone back to his own apartment with promises to return the next evening for the cooking show marathon they had been planning, Tyler had lain awake staring at the ceiling and trying to convince himself that the growing feelings he harbored for his friend were nothing more than misplaced gratitude for having someone to talk to, someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company and didn't make him feel like he needed to be anyone other than exactly who he was. But as the days turned into weeks and Kyle continued to seek out Tyler's company with an eagerness that seemed to go beyond simple neighborly friendliness, Tyler found it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that what he felt was purely platonic. There were too many moments when he caught Kyle watching him with an expression that Tyler couldn't quite decipher. Too many times when Kyle's hand would linger on Tyler's shoulder or their knees would bump together on the couch and neither of them would move away. The breaking point had come on a cold November evening when Kyle had shown up at Tyler's door looking more disheveled than usual, his hair mussed and his eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested he'd been crying, though Tyler knew better than to ask directly. Rough day? Tyler had asked instead, stepping aside to let Kyle into the apartment, noting the way his friend's hands trembled slightly as he shrugged out of his jacket. Rough week, more like, Kyle had replied, collapsing onto Tyler's couch with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. I ended things with Jessica. Tyler had felt his heart skip a beat at this news, though he'd tried to keep his expression neutral as he settled onto the couch beside Kyle, leaving what he hoped was an appropriate amount of space between them, even as every instinct screamed at him to close the distance, to offer comfort in the form of physical contact. I'm sorry, Tyler had said, and meant it, because even though the selfish part of him was relieved that Kyle was no longer dating the blonde marketing executive who seemed perfectly nice but utterly wrong for him, Tyler genuinely hated seeing his friend in pain. Are you, though? Kyle had asked, turning to face Tyler with an intensity that made Tyler's breath catch. Because I keep thinking about what you said, about forcing connections that aren't meant to happen, and I realize that's exactly what I was doing with Jessica, trying to make myself feel something that just wasn't there. Tyler had swallowed hard, unsure how to respond to the weight of Kyle's gaze, the way his friend seemed to be studying every detail of his face as if searching for clues to some mystery that Tyler wasn't sure he understood himself. The thing is, Kyle had continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I think I know why it wasn't working with her, why it never works with any of them, but I'm scared to admit it because it changes everything. The air in the apartment had felt charged then, thick with possibility and terror in equal measure, and Tyler had found himself leaning forward almost unconsciously, drawn by the vulnerability in Kyle's voice, and the way his friend's eyes seemed to be pleading for something that Tyler desperately wanted to give, but wasn't sure he was brave enough to offer. What are you scared of? Tyler had asked, his own voice barely audible, and Kyle had closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. I'm scared that the reason I can't connect with anyone else is because I'm already connected to someone, and that someone is you, and I don't know what that means or what to do about it. But I know that every time I try to be with someone else, all I can think about is coming home to you, talking to you, being in this space that we've created together. Tyler's world had tilted on its axis in that moment, the careful walls he'd built around his feelings crumbling like sandcastles before a tide, and he'd found himself reaching out without conscious thought, his fingers brushing against Kyle's cheek in a gesture that was tender and terrifying and absolutely necessary. Kyle, he had whispered, and in that single word was contained everything he'd been afraid to say, every hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge, every dream he'd convinced himself was impossible. Kyle had leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed, and for a moment Tyler had thought this was it. This was the moment when everything would change, when the careful dance they'd been performing around each other for months would finally reach its crescendo. But then Kyle's eyes had snapped open, wide with something that looked like panic, and he'd pulled back abruptly. I should go, Kyle had said, standing up so quickly that Tyler had felt dizzy trying to follow the movement. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said any of that. I'm obviously not thinking clearly right now. Tyler had wanted to protest, to tell Kyle that he didn't need to apologize, that everything he'd said had been exactly what Tyler had been hoping to hear for months. But the words had stuck in his throat, paralyzed by the fear that pushing too hard would drive Kyle away entirely. It's okay, Tyler had managed instead, though it wasn't okay at all, watching Kyle gather his jacket and head for the door with jerky, agitated movements that spoke of a man fleeing from something he wasn't ready to face. I just need some time to think, Kyle had said from the doorway, not quite meeting Tyler's eyes. This is all very confusing and I don't want to mess up our friendship by doing something stupid. Tyler had nodded, even though every fiber of his being had wanted to argue that what was happening between them wasn't stupid, wasn't something to run from, but rather something precious and rare that deserved to be explored and nurtured. Instead, he'd watched Kyle disappear down the hallway and then spent the rest of the night pacing his apartment and replaying every word of their conversation, analyzing every inflection and gesture for clues about what Kyle was really thinking and feeling. The days that followed had been torture, a careful dance of avoidance punctuated by brief encounters in the hallway that were polite but strained, lacking the easy warmth that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. Tyler had thrown himself into his work, accepting assignments that required him to travel and spending long hours in coffee shops and libraries, anywhere that wasn't his apartment with its reminders of Kyle's presence and the conversations they'd shared. But even as he tried to give Kyle the space he'd asked for, Tyler found himself analyzing every interaction, every text message, every casual greeting in the hallway for signs of what Kyle was thinking. Whether he regretted his confession or was simply trying to process feelings that were as new and confusing for him as they were overwhelming for Tyler. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks later, on a December evening when Tyler had been working late on an article about urban farming, his laptop balanced on his knees as he sat on the couch with a cup of tea growing cold on the coffee table beside him. The knock on his door had been soft, almost hesitant, and when Tyler opened it to find Kyle standing there with snowflakes in his hair and an expression of nervous determination on his face, Tyler's heart had leaped into his throat. Can we talk? Kyle had asked, and Tyler had stepped aside with but hesitation, noting the way Kyle's hand shook slightly as he removed his coat, the way he seemed to be gathering courage for something significant. They had settled on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them feeling both vast and charged with electricity, and for a long moment neither of them had spoken. The silence stretching taut as a wire until Tyler thought he might scream from the tension. "I've been thinking about what I said," Kyle had finally begun, his voice careful and measured, as if he'd rehearsed these words. "About being confused and not knowing what it means, and I think I was lying to myself about that." Tyler's breath had caught, but he'd forced himself to remain silent, to let Kyle find his way to whatever he needed to say without interruption or pressure. "The truth is, I do know what it means," Kyle had continued, his gaze fixed on his hands where they twisted together in his lap. "I know that every relationship I've tried to have has felt like I was acting in a play, reading lines that didn't belong to me, trying to feel things that just weren't there. I know that the only time I feel like myself, really myself, is when I'm with you." Tyler had felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the honesty in Kyle's voice and the courage it must have taken for him to come here and say these things. "I know that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether I'll see you that day. And when I go to bed at night, I replay every conversation we've had, every moment we've shared, like they're precious things I need to memorize in case they disappear." Kyle had looked up then, meeting Tyler's eyes for the first time since he'd started speaking, and Tyler had seen his own feelings reflected there. The same mixture of hope and terror and desperate longing that had been his constant companion for months. "I know that I'm probably not the person you thought I was when we first met," Kyle had said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know this changes things in ways that might be scary or complicated, but I also know that I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship." Tyler had felt something break open in his chest then, a dam bursting after months of careful containment, and he'd found himself moving across the couch without conscious thought, closing the distance between them until he was close enough to see the flecks of gold in Kyle's green eyes, close enough to count the freckles scattered across his nose. "Kyle," Tyler had whispered, reaching out to cup his friend's face in his hands, thumbs brushing across the sharp angles of his cheekbones. "You are exactly the person I thought you were. Exactly the person I hoped you might be. And what you feel for me is exactly what I've been feeling for you since the night we first met." Kyle's eyes had widened at this confession, and Tyler had seen the moment when understanding dawned, when the careful walls Kyle had built around his feelings crumbled, just as Tyler's had moments before. "Really?" Kyle had asked, and there was such vulnerability in that single word, such hope mixed with disbelief, that Tyler had felt his heart clench with the force of his affection for this man who had somehow become the center of his universe without either of them quite realizing when it had happened. "Really?" Tyler had confirmed, leaning forward until their foreheads touched, until he could feel the warmth of Kyle's breath against his lips. "I've been in love with you for months, Kyle. I've been trying to convince myself that what I felt was just gratitude for your friendship. But the truth is that you've become the most important person in my world. And the thought of losing you because I was too scared to be honest about my feelings has been eating me alive." Kyle had made a small tone then, something between a laugh and a sob, and his hands had come up to cover Tyler's where they still cupped his face. "Can I kiss you?" Kyle had asked, the words barely audible, and Tyler had nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly, overwhelmed by the reality of this moment he'd dreamed about so many times but never quite believed could actually happen. The first brush of Kyle's lips against his had been tentative, questioning, as if Kyle was still half convinced that this might be a dream or a mistake that would evaporate if he moved too quickly. But when Tyler had responded, pressing closer and deepening the kiss, Kyle had melted against him with a sigh that spoke of months of suppressed longing finally finding release. They had kissed until Tyler's lungs burned from lack of oxygen, until his lips felt swollen and sensitive, until the careful boundaries that had defined their friendship had been thoroughly and irrevocably crossed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Tyler had found himself staring into Kyle's eyes and seeing his own wonder reflected there. "Wow," Kyle had whispered, and Tyler had laughed, a sound of pure joy that bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. "Wow," Tyler had agreed, and then they had been kissing again, with more certainty this time, more urgency, as if they were trying to make up for all the months of careful distance and suppressed desire in a single moment. When they finally separated again, Kyle had rested his forehead against Tyler's, his eyes closed and his breathing still uneven. "I'm terrified," Kyle had admitted, his voice barely audible. "This is all so new for me, and I don't know how to navigate any of it, and I'm scared that I'm going to mess this up somehow." Tyler had felt his heart clench with tenderness for this man who had been brave enough to cross every line, to risk everything for the possibility of something real and true between them. "We'll figure it out together," Tyler had said, pressing a soft kiss to Kyle's temple. "We don't have to have all these answers right now. We just have to be honest with each other and take it one day at a time." Kyle had nodded against Tyler's shoulder, and they had sat there for a long time, wrapped around each other on Tyler's couch, talking in whispers about their fears and hopes in the strange, wonderful territory they were entering together. That had been 3 months ago, and in the time since, they had indeed figured it out together, slowly and carefully, and with more joy than Tyler had ever thought possible. They had navigated the awkward conversations about Kyle's previous relationships and Tyler's own dating history, had weathered the initial uncertainty about how to balance their friendship with this new romantic dimension, had learned each other's rhythms and needs and the particular ways they each expressed love. Kyle had moved into Tyler's apartment officially 2 weeks ago, and they had spent the previous evening rearranging furniture and hanging Kyle's artwork on the walls, creating a space that felt truly theirs rather than just Tyler's, with Kyle as a frequent visitor. They had talked about the future, about the possibility of getting a oh, she ba yalay mo ba ito, about the vacation they wanted to take to Italy in the spring, about all the ordinary and extraordinary ways they wanted to build a life together. But tonight, standing in the doorway with rain dripping from his hair and vulnerability written across every line of his face, Kyle looked exactly as he had that first night when he'd knocked on Tyler's door with beer and a smile, and Tyler feels the same flutter of recognition, the same sense of coming home. "I was lying in bed thinking about how different my life is now compared to 6 months ago," Kyle says, stepping fully into the apartment and letting Tyler close the door behind him. "How much happier I am, how much more like myself I feel, and I realize that I never properly thanked you for being patient with me while I figured everything out." Tyler reaches for Kyle's hands, noting how cold they are from his walk through the rain, and brings them to his lips to press warm kisses to his knuckles. "You don't need to thank me for that," Tyler says softly. "Loving you has never felt like work, Kyle. Even when things were complicated and uncertain, even when I was scared that I was reading the situation wrong, being with you has always felt like the most natural thing in the world." Kyle's eyes soften at these words, and he steps closer, eliminating the last bit of space between them, his cold hands coming up to frame Tyler's face in a mirror of that first night when everything had changed. "I love you," Kyle says. And though it's not the first time he's said those words, Tyler still feels his heart skip a beat at hearing them, still feels the same rush of wonder and gratitude that this extraordinary man has chosen to build a life with him. "I love you too," Tyler replies. And then Kyle is kissing him, soft and sweet and tasting like the peppermint tea he drinks before bed. And Tyler thinks about how far they've both come from that first tentative conversation about forcing connections that aren't meant to happen. Because this, what they have built together through honesty and patience and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other, doesn't feel forced at all. It feels inevitable, like coming home, like the missing piece Tyler hadn't even realized he'd been searching for his entire life. When they break apart, Kyle rests his forehead against Tyler's, and Tyler can see the contentment in his eyes, the peace that comes from finally being exactly where and with whom you belong. "Come to bed," Tyler whispers, taking Kyle's hand and leading him toward the bedroom they now share, past the bookshelf where Tyler's novels sit next to Kyle's art books, past the kitchen table where they share morning coffee and evening wine, past all the small domestic details that make up the life they're building together. As they settle into bed, Kyle curled against Tyler's side with his head on Tyler's chest. Tyler thinks about the conversation that started it all, about Kyle's theory that people who kill plants aren't bad at taking care of things. They're just too focused on trying to control the outcome instead of letting things grow naturally. They had learned to let this grow naturally, Tyler reflects, to trust in the organic development of their feelings rather than trying to force them into predetermined shapes. They had learned that love, real love, doesn't follow scripts or timelines or the expectations of others, but rather unfolds in its own time and in its own way. Beautiful and surprising and absolutely worth the wait. "What are you thinking about?" Kyle asks softly, his voice already heavy with sleep, and Tyler presses a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with the rain from outside. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Tyler says, and means it with every fiber of his being. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the best things in life are the ones that catch you completely off guard, the ones you never saw coming but can't imagine living without once they arrive." Kyle makes a small sound of agreement, his arm tightening around Tyler's waist, and within minutes his breathing has evened out into the steady rhythm of sleep. Tyler lies awake a little longer, listening to the rain against the window and the soft sounds of Kyle's breathing, marveling at the simple miracle of having this person in his bed, in his life, in his heart. 6 months ago, Tyler had been content with solitude, convinced that he was better off alone than trying to force connections that felt artificial and unsatisfying. 6 months ago, Kyle had been going through the motions of dating women who looked perfect on paper, but left him feeling empty and disconnected from his own life. Now they are here together, having found in each other not just romantic love, but also the deepest kind of friendship, the sense of being truly seen and accepted and cherished for exactly who they are. They have created something beautiful and real and lasting, something that grows stronger with each passing day rather than fading under the weight of familiarity. Tyler thinks about the future stretching out before them, full of ordinary mornings and extraordinary moments, full of challenges they'll face together and joys they'll share, full of all the small daily choices that add up to a life well lived. He thinks about growing old with Kyle, about the conversations they'll have and the memories they'll make, about the way their love will deepen and evolve while remaining fundamentally rooted in the same recognition that brought them together in the first place. The recognition that some connections are meant to happen, that some people are meant to find each other, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin with friendship and grow into something that encompasses every aspect of two people's lives. As Tyler finally drifts off to sleep, Kyle's warmth pressed against his side and the sound of rain providing a gentle soundtrack to his dreams, he understands that this is what happiness looks like. Not the dramatic, overwhelming passion of movies and novels, but this quiet contentment, this sense of being exactly where he belongs with exactly the right person. In the morning, Tyler wakes to the smell of coffee and the sound of Kyle moving around in the kitchen, humming softly under his breath as he prepares breakfast for both of them. It's a small thing, this domestic routine they've fallen into, but it fills Tyler with a warmth that has nothing to do with the sunshine streaming through the bedroom windows and everything to do with the knowledge that this is his life now, that he gets to wake up every morning to the sound of Kyle's voice and the promise of another day spent building something beautiful together. Tyler finds Kyle standing at the stove, still in his pajama pants and one of Tyler's old t-shirts, his hair sticking up at odd angles from sleep. He looks young and relaxed and absolutely perfect, and Tyler feels his heart swell with the same mixture of love and gratitude that has become his constant companion since the night Kyle first confessed his feelings. "Good morning," Tyler says, wrapping his arms around Kyle's waist from behind and pressing a kiss to the spot where his neck meets his shoulder, tasting the salt of his skin and breathing in the familiar scent that has become synonymous with home. "Good morning," Kyle replies, leaning back into Tyler's embrace and tilting his head to give him better access to his neck. "I made your favorite, blueberry pancakes with that fancy syrup your sister sent from Vermont." Tyler's chest tightens with emotion at this simple gesture, at the way Kyle has memorized all his preferences and takes joy in small acts of care and attention. It's these moments, Tyler thinks, these quiet demonstrations of love and thoughtfulness, that matter more than grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations. "You spoil me," Tyler murmurs against Kyle's ear, and Kyle laughs, a sound that never fails to make Tyler smile. "I like spoiling you." Kyle says, turning in Tyler's arms so they're face to face, his hands coming up to rest on Tyler's chest. I like taking care of you. I like making you happy. I like being the person who gets to love you every single day. Tyler feels tears prick at his eyes at the simple honesty in Kyle's voice, at the way he says these things as if they're the most natural truths in the world rather than the precious gifts Tyler knows them to be. I like being loved by you, Tyler says softly, cupping Kyle's face in his hands and brushing his thumbs across the familiar landscape of his cheekbones. I like waking up next to you and falling asleep in your arms and everything in between. They stand there for a moment, wrapped around each other in the morning light, and Tyler thinks about how different this is from any relationship he's had before, how easy and natural and right it feels to be this open with another person, to let himself be seen and known and loved without reservation. The pancakes burn slightly while they kiss, but neither of them minds, too caught up in the simple pleasure of being together, of starting another day in the life they've built through patience and honesty and the willingness to let love grow in its own time and its own way. Later, as they sit at the kitchen table sharing breakfast and reading different sections of the newspaper, their feet tangled together under the table in an unconscious gesture of connection, Tyler reflects on the journey that brought them here. It hasn't always been easy, this process of learning to love and be loved, of navigating the transition from friendship to something deeper and more complex. There have been moments of uncertainty and fear, times when Kyle's inexperience with same-sex relationships led to anxiety about whether he was doing things right, whether his feelings were real, or just confusion brought on by the intensity of their friendship. There have been conversations about coming out to family and friends, about dealing with the occasional stare or comment from strangers who don't understand or approve of their relationship. But through it all, they have remained committed to honesty and communication, to working through their fears together, rather than letting them drive them apart. They have learned that love is not just a feeling, but also a choice, a daily decision to prioritize each other's happiness and well-being, to support each other's dreams and goals, to create a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. What are your plans for today? Kyle asks, reaching across the table to steal a piece of Tyler's pancake, and Tyler smiles at the casual intimacy of the gesture, the way they've learned to share space and food and time as if it's the most natural thing in the world. I have that interview with the Urban Planning Committee at 2, Tyler says, but other than that, I'm free. What about you? I'm meeting with a potential client about a website redesign, but it shouldn't take more than a couple of hours, Kyle replies. Want to do something together this evening? Maybe cook dinner and watch that documentary about sustainable architecture you've been wanting to see? Tyler nods, warmth spreading through his chest at the simple pleasure of making plans with someone who knows his interests and preferences, who wants to spend time with him, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely enjoy each other's company. That sounds perfect, Tyler says, and means it completely. This is what he's learned about love in the months since Kyle first appeared at his door with beer and uncertainty and the courage to risk everything for the possibility of something real. Love is not just the dramatic moments of confession and first kisses, though those are important too. Love is also this, the quiet contentment of planning an evening together, the simple pleasure of sharing breakfast and newspaper sections, the knowledge that you have found someone who wants to build a life with you one ordinary day at a time. As Kyle gets ready for his meeting, Tyler watches him move around their shared space with the easy familiarity of someone who belongs here, who has made this apartment as much his home as Tyler's. Kyle's artwork hangs on the walls now. His books fill half the bookshelf. His coffee mug sits in the cabinet next to Tyler's, and his presence has transformed what was once a solitary space into something that feels alive and shared and full of love. I'll see you tonight, Kyle says, pressing a quick kiss to Tyler's lips before heading for the door. And Tyler feels the same flutter of anticipation he's felt every time Kyle has left for work or errands, the same eagerness to see him again and hear about his day and continue the ongoing conversation that has become the soundtrack to their life together. After Kyle leaves, Tyler settles at his desk to prepare for his interview, but finds his mind wandering to thoughts of the future, to the conversations they've been having about taking the next steps in their relationship. They've talked about moving to a larger apartment, about the possibility of adopting a dog from the shelter downtown, about the trip to Italy they're planning for the spring, and all the places they want to explore together. They've also talked about more serious things, about the possibility of marriage someday, about what it would mean to make their commitment to each other official and legal and recognized by the world at large. These conversations still feel surreal to Tyler sometimes. The idea that he has found someone who wants to plan a future with him, who sees their relationship not as a temporary arrangement, but as something permanent and lasting. But even more than the big plans and major milestones, Tyler finds himself looking forward to the small daily moments that make up a shared life. The morning coffee and evening wine, the grocery shopping and bill paying, and all the mundane tasks that become meaningful when done with someone you love. The inside jokes and shared references that will accumulate over years of living together. The way they'll learn each other's rhythms and preferences even more deeply, becoming fluent in the language of each other's needs and desires. Tyler thinks about Kyle's theory about plants again, about letting things grow naturally instead of trying to control the outcome, and realize that this is exactly what they've done with their relationship. They've allowed it to develop organically, following its own timeline and its own logic, rather than trying to force it into predetermined shapes or expectations. The result is something that feels both surprising and inevitable, both fragile and incredibly strong. They have built something together that neither of them could have imagined when Kyle first knocked on Tyler's door. Something that has exceeded both their expectations and their dreams. Tyler's interview goes well, and by the time he returns to the apartment that evening, Kyle is already there, standing in the kitchen with ingredients spread across the counter and music playing softly from his phone. He looks up when Tyler enters, his face lighting up with a smile that still makes Tyler's heart skip a beat even after all these months together. "How did it go?" Kyle asks, abandoning his cooking preparations to wrap Tyler in a hug that smells like garlic and herbs and the cologne Kyle wears to client meetings. "Really well, I think," Tyler says, melting into Kyle's embrace and feeling the stress of the day dissolve in the warmth of his partner's arms. "They seemed interested in my ideas about community engagement and urban planning processes. How was your meeting?" "Great, actually. The client wants me to redesign their entire web presence, which means steady work for the next few months," Kyle says, pulling back to look at Tyler with excitement dancing in his green eyes. "I was thinking we could celebrate with that bottle of champagne we've been saving." Tyler nods enthusiastically, touched by Kyle's desire to share his good news, to mark his professional success as something they've achieved together, rather than something that belongs only to him. This is another thing Tyler has learned about love, the way it transforms individual experiences into shared ones, creating a sense of partnership that extends beyond romance into every aspect of their lives. They cook dinner together, moving around each other in the kitchen, with the practiced ease of two people who have learned each other's rhythms, who can anticipate each other's needs and preferences without conscious thought. Kyle chops vegetables while Tyler prepares the pasta sauce, and they talk about their respective days, about the documentary they're planning to watch, about the weekend trip they're taking to visit Tyler's sister, Sarah Martinez, who has been eager to meet Kyle properly since Tyler first mentioned him in their weekly phone calls. "Are you nervous about meeting Sarah?" Tyler asks as they sit down to eat, noting the slight tension in Kyle's shoulders that suggests he might be more anxious about the upcoming visit than he's been willing to admit. "A little," Kyle confesses, twirling pasta around his fork with more concentration than the task requires. "I want her to like me. I want her to see how happy we are together, but I also know how important she is to you. And I'm worried that if she doesn't approve of me or our relationship, it might create problems between you two." Tyler reaches across the table to cover Kyle's hand with his own, squeezing gently in a gesture of reassurance and support. "Sarah is going to love you," Tyler says with complete confidence. "She's been telling me for years that I needed to find someone who made me happy, someone who brought out the best in me, and you do both of those things and so much more. Besides, she's already half in love with you just from the way I talk about you in our phone calls." Kyle's expression softens at this, and he turns his hand palm up to intertwine their fingers, a gesture that has become second nature to both of them over the months they've been together. "I love how close you are with your family," Kyle says. I love that you want me to be part of that you're not trying to keep different parts of your life separate. Tyler feels his chest tighten with emotion at Kyle's words, at the vulnerability they reveal and the trust they represent. He knows that Kyle's own relationship with his family has been more complicated, that his parents are still adjusting to the news of his relationship with Tyler, that there have been difficult conversations and moments of tension as they work through their own preconceptions and expectations. You are part of my life, Tyler says simply. All of it. The good parts and the challenging parts, the family gatherings and the quiet evenings at home, the professional successes and the personal struggles. That's what partnership means to me, Kyle. It means that we're in this together, completely and without reservation. They finish dinner as the sun sets outside their kitchen window, painting the apartment in golden light that makes everything feel warm and magical and perfect. The documentary is engaging and thought-provoking, but Tyler finds himself more interested in watching Kyle's reactions to it, the way his face lights up when they discuss particularly interesting concepts, the way he unconsciously reaches for Tyler's hand during the more emotional segments. Later, as they get ready for bed, Tyler watches Kyle brush his teeth and thinks about how domestic and ordinary and absolutely wonderful this all is. 6 months ago, he had been brushing his teeth alone, going to bed alone, waking up alone, and while he had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the complications of relationships, he now understands that he had simply never found the right person to share his life with. Kyle catches him staring in the bathroom mirror and grins around his toothbrush, and Tyler laughs at the absurdity of finding even this moment romantic and meaningful. But that's what love has done to him, he realizes. It has made everything more vivid and significant, has turned the most mundane activities into opportunities for connection and joy. What are you thinking about? Kyle asks as they settle into bed, echoing his question from the night before, and Tyler pulls him close, marveling at how perfectly Kyle fits against his side, how natural and right this feels. I'm thinking about how much I love our life together, Tyler says honestly. I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you were brave enough to knock on my door that first night, brave enough to admit your feelings even when you were scared and confused, brave enough to take a chance on something that was completely new for both of us. Kyle tilts his head up to look at Tyler, and in the dim light from the bedside lamp, Tyler can see the depth of emotion in his green eyes, the same wonder and gratitude and overwhelming love that Tyler feels in his own chest. I'm thinking about how much I love you, Kyle says softly, and how lucky I am that you were patient enough to wait for me to figure things out, generous enough to help me navigate all the uncertainty and fear, and loving enough to see me through all the messy parts of discovering who I really am. Tyler feels tears prick at his eyes at the honesty in Kyle's voice, at the way he continues to find new ways to express his love and appreciation, to make Tyler feel seen and valued and cherished. We figured it out together, Tyler corrects gently, pressing a soft kiss to Kyle's forehead. That's what we do, Kyle. We figure things out together. We support each other through the scary parts. We celebrate each other's victories and help each other through the challenges. That's what love is, what partnership is. They lie there for a while, talking quietly about their plans for the weekend, about the book Tyler is reading and the project Kyle is working on, about all the small details that make up their shared life. Eventually, their voices grow softer and their responses longer as sleep begins to claim them. But even as Tyler drifts off, he remains acutely aware of Kyle's presence beside him, the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his body pressed against Tyler's side. Tyler's last conscious thought is about the rain that brought Kyle to his door just hours ago, how it seemed to wash away the last remnants of uncertainty and fear, leaving behind only the clear, bright truth of their love for each other. He thinks about the journey they have taken together, from that first night of nervous conversation over beer to this moment of complete contentment and security. And he understands that this is what he's been searching for his entire life without even realizing it. Not just romantic love, though that is certainly part of it, but this sense of complete partnership, of finding someone who sees him clearly and loves him completely, who wants to build a life together based on honesty and mutual respect and genuine affection. Someone who makes him laugh and challenges him intellectually and supports his dreams while sharing his own. Someone who transforms the ordinary moments of daily life into something magical and meaningful through the simple fact of their presence. In the morning, Tyler wakes to find Kyle already up, standing by the bedroom window with a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the last of the rain clouds clear from the sky. The morning light catches the gold highlights in his brown hair and illuminates the peaceful expression on his face. And Tyler feels his heart swell with the same mixture of love and gratitude that has become his constant companion since the night everything changed between them. "Good morning," Tyler says softly, not wanting to startle Kyle from his quiet contemplation. And Kyle turns with a smile that transforms his entire face. "Good morning," Kyle replies, crossing to the bed and settling beside Tyler, careful not to spill his coffee. "I was just thinking about how different everything looks in the morning light. How last night's storm seems like something that happened in a completely different world." Tyler understands exactly what Kyle means, because he feels it too. This sense that they have emerged from some kind of crucible, stronger and more connected than ever before. The vulnerability and honesty of the previous evening, the way they had opened themselves completely to each other, has created a new level of intimacy and trust between them. "I love you," Tyler says, because it's the only response that feels adequate to the moment, to the depth of feeling that Kyle's presence inspires in him. "I love you too," Kyle replies, setting his coffee aside and leaning down to kiss Tyler softly. A kiss that tastes like morning and promises and the bright future that stretches out before them. They spend the morning in bed, talking and laughing and making plans for the day, for the weekend, for the life they're building together, one conversation at a time. Tyler thinks about how far they've both come from that first tentative evening when Kyle had knocked on his door with beard and uncertainty, how they've learned to navigate the complexities of love and partnership through patience and communication, and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. He thinks about the future that awaits them, full of ordinary mornings like this one and extraordinary moments yet to be discovered, full of challenges they'll face together and joys they'll share, full of all the small daily choices that add up to a life well lived and deeply loved. As Kyle gets up to start breakfast and Tyler stretches luxuriously in their shared bed, listening to the sounds of his partner moving around in their kitchen, humming softly under his breath as he prepares food for both of them, Tyler understands that this is what happiness looks like. Not the dramatic, overwhelming passion of movies and novels, but this quiet contentment, this sense of being exactly where he belongs with exactly the right person. The rain has stopped completely now, and sunlight streams through the bedroom windows, illuminating the space they've created together. The home they've built through love and patience and the courage to let something beautiful grow in its own time, in its own way. Tyler can hear Kyle calling his name from the kitchen, can smell coffee and bacon, and the promise of another day spent building something meaningful together. As he gets up to join Kyle, to start another day in the life they've chosen to share, Tyler thinks about Kyle's theory about plants one more time, about letting things grow naturally instead of trying to control the outcome. They had learned to let their love grow naturally, to trust in the organic development of their feelings rather than trying to force them into predetermined shapes. The result is something that feels both surprising and inevitable, both fragile and incredibly strong. They have built something together that neither of them could have imagined when Kyle first knocked on Tyler's door, something that has exceeded both their expectations and their dreams. And as Tyler walks into the kitchen to find Kyle standing at the stove with a smile on his face and love in his eyes, ready to share another meal and another conversation and another ordinary, extraordinary day together, he understands that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin with friendship and grow into something that encompasses every aspect of two people's lives. Sometimes the most frightening dares lead to the most beautiful discoveries. And sometimes the person you're meant to love has been standing right in front of you all along, waiting for the right moment to step across the threshold and into the life you're meant to build together.